Is the mic on? Yes. Gather ye rosebuds as ye may. They're coming. We have just a few stragglers at the back, so we'll wait for people to sit and then we'll start. So it looks like a few people are going in the wrong direction, so I think we'll get started anyway because we want to be mindful of everybody's time. So I think all of you know my name is Peggy, and I am a member of the I'm a member of so many different things. I'm a member of the Justice Through Service Committee with Mount Zion, and I've been asked to introduce our speaker this morning. We're very happy to welcome Isaiah Reitzman as our presenter for this series of workshops on the climate emergency. He's a community educator with the Working Centre and is passionate about the intersections between environmental sustainability, economic justice, community building. Part of his role at the Working Centre is to facilitate workshops, documentary nights, neighbourhood walks, and more on ways that we might respond to the climate emergency. He graduated with a Master's of Theological Studies from Conrad Grebel College and the University of Waterloo in 2015. And he may have a few more things to tell us about himself, so I'm going to just step out of the way and welcome Isaiah, sorry.
I think I'm able to do this, unless someone tells me otherwise. Thank you, everyone, for your invitation for me to join you this morning, both for worship and to facilitate this workshop on the Climate Emergency 101. So like Peggy says, my name is Isaiah Reitzman, and I'm a community educator with the Working Centre. One of the things that we try to do in my work, doing community education at the Working Centre, is find ways to connect kind of big theoretical ideas, analysis about the world in which we live, to action and to community building. So I'm really excited to be here this morning to share with you this workshop and facilitated discussion on the climate emergency. I'm wondering, can I have one volunteer to help me pass out these pens and these pieces of paper? Okay, thanks, Peggy. So this is the first of 7 workshops that I'm offering through the Working Centre on the climate emergency and climate justice. And this is an introductory workshop. And what I'm going to assume here this morning is that everyone has knowledge. I view myself as a facilitator more than a teacher, and I'm assuming all of you know something about the climate emergency. So as we begin today, I want us to imagine that what we're doing today is a fill-in-the-gaps type exercise. I think you all have knowledge, you all have awareness, you all have commitment to justice, understanding the ecological emergency. And so, all that to say, some of what we'll be discussing this morning will seem foundational. Some of it you might say, well, I've heard this 1,000 times. That's okay. The workshop is partially designed just to test your own level of awareness, your own level of knowledge about these issues. So there are 10 sections that are part of this workshop, and at the beginning of each section, I will ask you a question. And I'll give you a minute, and on this piece of paper that's being handed out, I'll just ask you to reflect on how you would answer that question. Again, because I'm assuming here that we all have some basic knowledge here, and we're just filling in the gaps together. So I'll just wait until the paper is being handed out. But as we do, I can begin with the first question, the most foundational question. What is the greenhouse effect? So not looking for any conversation at this point, but just on your piece of paper to write down how you would define what the greenhouse effect is. I'll just give you a minute to reflect on this. For those of you who are streaming online right now or watching this afterwards, you can feel free to join us in this, but please don't Google. Don't Wikipedia this. Use your own head. About 30 more seconds. Okay, yep. As you're reflecting on this question, somewhere on your piece of paper, write the number 10, and beside it, just estimate for yourself how literate are you about climate change and the climate emergency. This is just a personal thing. It's not a test. Just on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you think you already know about the climate emergency? 10 being 10 out of 10, you know it perfectly. 1 out of 10, you don't know it at all. And then at the end of our workshop today, you'll return to that rating. So again, on a scale of 1 to 10, how knowledgeable are you on the climate emergency? Okay. So the greenhouse effect, very simply put, names how certain chemicals in the atmosphere, mainly carbon dioxide, but also things like methane, act to trap heat like a greenhouse, and is the primary mechanism behind climate change. I think this is foundational. Many of us know this, but just viscerally right now, imagine you're in a greenhouse in the summer. I remember when I was volunteering at a garden, just stepping inside the greenhouse, feeling the difference of temperature on a June day, inside versus outside. Just viscerally, I think that's a really helpful way of imagining what's going on in our atmosphere. Oh. This is a really important graph. This is from the US government. This tracks global temperature and atmospheric carbon dioxide over 800,000 years. So as you can see, every time carbon dioxide goes up, average global temperatures go up, like this, for 800,000 years. But as you'll notice, that little red line at the end, that tracks extra carbon dioxide levels since 1950 of this year. Or, sorry, since 1950. So the second question, and again, I'll give you a minute to answer this. What is anthropogenic climate change? And why is this important? So this is a term you'll often hear on CBC, in the newspapers. Scientists, journalists will talk about this. What is anthropogenic climate change, and why is this important? Again, I do recognize that for some of you, this is a bit of a review, but that's okay. It's good to go back to the basics sometimes. About 15 more seconds. Also, don't worry, I'm not going to be collecting these at the end to test you. This is just for your sake. Anthropogenic climate change. In a word, this time it's us. For the last 800,000 years, every time global carbon dioxide goes up, and with it temperature, it hasn't been us. It's been the natural processes of our planet. But this time, it's because of human activities. That is, the extra greenhouse gases, both carbon dioxide and others, in the atmosphere are due to human activity. So the type of greenhouse gases that are warming our atmosphere currently are because of what we collectively, as human civilizations, have been doing for the past 200 years. The source here is Our World in Data. This is global carbon dioxide concentration since Christ, since the year 1 CE. As you can see, it essentially stays stable up until the year 1800, near the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and then it skyrockets. And this is the means. I was thinking about the old game Clue. You know, it was Colonel Mustard in the kitchen with the knife. It was us in the atmosphere using these means. Fossil fuels, burning oil, natural gas, and coal. This is what's been releasing the extra carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. So again, anthropogenic climate change. Anthropogenic means human origin, human, genesis, beginning through human activity, climate change. So this time it's us. It's not far away. In fact, it's already begun. So thinking about how it's already begun, often scientists, world leaders, journalists will talk about average global temperature rising. So how much already has average temperatures arisen globally in Celsius? Might make you think back to what did they say on the news this morning? About 15 seconds. Oh. So I wanted to pause and talk about climate change so far, because sometimes we talk about climate change as if it's a future thing, but it's not. As this picture from Australia from a couple years ago, or the pictures from Kelowna or Hawaii or the Northwest Territories this summer has shown, climate change and its effects are already happening. Already, average global temperatures have risen about a degree Celsius since the year 1750. And already we are facing climate change in the form of extreme weather, worse wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, etc. Now we're getting into a little bit more complicated territory. The first three questions may have been easier to answer, but now I'm going to ask you to start answering a little bit harder questions. What is a carbon budget? Remember, there are no wrong answers here. It's just in learning, it's helpful to try and imagine what the answers will be before you're actually given the answers. Carbon budgets. You hear activists, journalists, politicians talking about it. What do people mean? Uh, 15 more seconds. I think this is probably one of the most important parts of our presentation this morning, just conceptually. So, a carbon budget, simply put, is how much carbon dioxide humanity can emit before we crash through a certain temperature threshold. So we already talked about average warming being about 1.1 degrees Celsius. These are potential further warmings, 1.5, 2, 3 degrees average Celsius. And a temperature threshold is the average global warming measured in degrees Celsius we aim not to cross. So the 2015 Paris Agreement, nations all around the world agreed to try to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so a carbon budget is about how much greenhouse gases, how much carbon we could emit before going beyond one of those temperature thresholds. Here are the remaining carbon budgets. This is actually from a year ago, November 2022. But I want to point out the difference here. So to stay below 1.5 degrees, we have a carbon budget of 380 gigatons globally. For 1.7, it's a little bit larger, and for 2 degrees, it's even larger than that. But I think this indicates just like how much wiggle room do we have before crashing through these temperature thresholds. I also recognize in the first half hour of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about numbers, but nearer to the end, I'm going to be talking concretely of what is 1.5, what is 2, what does 3 degrees look like in terms of our lives here, but our lives globally across the planet. So just as a financial budget names how much money we can spend, helping us know how much we can allocate, like you personally have budgets, your church has a budget, our region has a budget. So in the same way, a carbon budget names how much carbon we can safely emit, helping us to figure out how to allocate within those limits. So if we have 380 gigatons globally we can emit safely, that's pretty limited. So how do we collectively decide what we're going to do with that? And I forget if I have this here, but you could also scale carbon budgets locally. So Waterloo Region could have a 1.5 degree carbon budget. You personally could also have that on a hyper-localized, personalized level. A carbon budget is a really useful tool to concretely imagine what our limitations are and how to be fair within those limitations. So at a global carbon budget is how much carbon we can safely emit or spend at a global level in order to stay below a certain temperature threshold. And a community carbon budget scales this down to a community level based on both population and fair share. A word of warning. Cities around the world are currently talking about doing carbon budgets. Oslo in Norway has done a carbon budget. Edmonton, Alberta has done a citywide carbon budget. Beware when cities talk about a carbon budget, because it will sound like they're talking about their whole community, but they're really talking about the corporation of the city, so the institution of the city. And that can be misleading. So there is some possibility within the next couple of years that the City of Waterloo, the region municipality, will talk about carbon budgeting. Make sure they're talking about community carbon budgeting and not just corporate carbon budgeting at a city level. Alrighty. Question 5. This is related to, based on the fact that we, actually, I'm not going to get to that yet. I'm going to ask you first. When activists, journalists, scientists talk about our timeline, they often talk about 50 by 30 and net zero by 50. What does this mean? Again, just 1 minute to reflect on this. 50 by 30 and 0 by 50. And when I say what does this mean, I say practically, not emotionally, because emotionally it means something too, but practically, what does 50 by 30 and 0 by 50 mean? 15 seconds. Ooh, I'm a little bit louder there. Okay. So besides carbon budgets, it's critical we think about our timelines. Because it's not a carbon budget forever. We have 380 gigatons for 100 years. No, it's within these timelines. This is the time we have. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change released a report that says the world has until 2030 to cut emissions by 50%, until 2050 to get to net zero, if we are to avoid catastrophic warming above 2 degrees. So the key thing here is we need to get to 0 to 50, but in order to do that, we need to cut emissions by 50% by 2030. So to use an example, if our ultimate goal is 0 by 50, why do we need 50 by 30 as an interim goal? Here's an example. This is from Green WR, a local environmental activist group. What they're showing here is if we tried to cut emissions by 50% by 2030, how much reduction would be required each year? So I'm going to spend some time on this graph because I think it's pretty important. For those of you at home, you can't see me point, I don't think, but I hope you can imagine this. So if we started our reduction September 1st of this year, we would have to regionally reduce about 100 tons of CO2 a year. But let's say we don't do anything for 3 years, and we start January 2026. Suddenly, we have to reduce 150 tons a year. But what if we don't do anything for 5 years, and we start January 1st, 2028? We would have to do 300 tons a year. I think this illustrates that we can't simply do nothing for 20 years and then by 2045 realize, oh, we have to get to net zero in 5 years. You can't do that. You know, if any of you, let's say, are going to Montreal and you know you have 8 hours to get to Montreal, you know you have to be in Toronto in a couple hours, right? In the same way, if we're going to get to this final goal of 0 by 50, we have to get to halfway there in a reasonable time, or we can't get all the way there. That's the key thing. And the reason why this is significant politically is because it's very easy for governments, for think tanks, to talk about 0 by 50. Because by the 2040s, they're not going to be in power. The EDs of those think tanks aren't going to be there anymore. It's easy to talk about 0 by 50. But to talk about 50 by 30 requires action. It requires honesty about inaction. So whenever you hear journalists, CBC, politicians talk about 0 by 50, ask about 50 by 30. Ask how on earth are we going to get to 0 by 50 if we don't get to 50 by 30? So as a review, a carbon budget, this is how much carbon we can safely emit to stay below a certain temperature threshold. And a carbon timeline is how many years we have left to cut emissions in order to stay below that threshold. So we can't cut emissions by 50% by 2050, because that will mean 2, 3, maybe even 4 degrees of average warming. We need action now. This is the final question of part 1. Are governments promising to do what needs to be done? I'll give you a minute. I see a couple people having that kind of sad, humorous smile on their face. I think we all might know the answer to this question. Are governments promising to do what needs to be done? About 15 seconds. This is a really powerful graph. There are different versions of this out there, but this is the clearest. This is from the New York Times, November 2021, before the UN Climate Change Conference a couple years ago. There are 3 colors I want to show to you. The first is the blue color. This is our safe emissions pathway. So if you imagine this bottom axis here being our timeline and that black dot being essentially today, this is the future lowering of emissions. So the blue line represents how quickly we need to lower our emissions to get to 1.5 degrees, to stay within that safe temperature threshold. The yellowish line represents what governments are currently promising. So under the Paris Agreement, every government worldwide puts in what's called their nationally determined contributions, which is what their plans are in terms of lowering emissions, what they're promising. And so the yellow is the amount of emissions that governments worldwide are promising to lower, and what that is over time. The orange, which is just above the yellow, is current policies. This is key. Current policies are what governments worldwide, national, provincial, state governments, are actually doing. So what we need is 1.5. What we're doing will get us to 3 degrees, and what we're promising will get us to 2 degrees. This is key. What we need, what governments are promising, and what governments are doing are 3 separate things. Again, needs, promises, and actions are different. This is a metaphor I've used before. Imagine that you're working for a boss or for a company, and you need to be paid $20 an hour in order to live. That's the living wage. You go to your boss saying, this is what I need in order to pay for rent and food and that kind of thing. But your boss instead promises to pay you $15 an hour, and yet in all actuality pays you $10 an hour. What you need, what they're promising, and what they're doing are 3 separate things. And this is what's going on globally with the climate crisis. This is another version of a similar graph. Here, the yellow line is the 1.5 degree compatible pathway, what we need. And the 2 blue lines are, again, representing what governments are both promising and what they're doing. Again, what we need versus even what we were being promised are very different. Now we're going to take a little bit of a break because that was a lot of information, and I know some of you are kind of spread out, so I'm going to ask over the next 5 to 7 minutes if you can get into groups of about 4 or 5 and just reflect together on what we've been talking about so far before part 2 of our presentation. So again, if you can find ways just to huddle up, groups of 4 or 5, and just have an open discussion of what we've been talking about. Sorry, I can't quite hear you. About 2 more minutes. Just make sure everyone has a chance to share their thoughts. About 30 more seconds. All right, for those of you here in person and for those watching online, I'll bring us back together at this point. So I wanted to make sure that I gave you a chance to talk, to digest some of this information. I know this can be a lot, and I think it's really important to give space for that kind of conversation. As you guys were talking, I was imagining what we're doing today is sort of like a jigsaw puzzle. If you've ever done a jigsaw puzzle where it's like mostly filled out, but there's like this little puzzle piece, this little puzzle piece that's missing, that's what we're doing today. We're not, a lot of you are very knowledgeable. I was overhearing your conversations, and so I know that for almost all of us, most of the jigsaw puzzle is filled out, but together we're putting in those last pieces about the climate emergency. So this second section is going to start getting a little bit more concrete. We had a lot of numbers in the first section. Now we're going to talk about what those numbers look like, what they mean. And we're going to do this in 3 parts. First, talking about the sources of our emissions. We already talked about fossil fuels, but we're going to be a bit more concrete here. Talking about the consequences, so not only the sources of climate change, but the concrete consequences of it. And then finally, what does it mean to act like we're in the climate emergency that we're in? So we're going to start with sources of our emissions, and like last time, we'll have introductory questions here. Oh, well, first of all, this is a carbon dioxide molecule, and unless you're a chemist like me, I've never seen one. We talk about it a lot. It's one of the most important one of the most important realities human beings are living with right now, but it's a very small reality. So we want small as in a chemical, atomic reality. So we want to imagine this a little bit more concretely. So question 7, and I'll give you a minute to reflect on this. What in your day-to-day life do you associate with carbon emissions? So not saying like you personally are responsible, the only people responsible for carbon change or for climate change, but just thinking about your day-to-day life, what is happening? What do you associate with excess carbon emissions? Go ahead. Yeah. Another way to ask this question is, what do you imagine when people talk about carbon emissions? Okay. So this particular graphic is from an article I wrote in the September 2020 issue of Good Work News, where I talked about sources of our carbon emissions, and thinking about, in terms of our households, the 4 sources of carbon emissions are related to transportation, home energy use, consumption, and then food and diets. So from the perspective of our own lives, these are the 4 areas of where carbon emissions come from. And I think this is largely true at the same time at a societal level. So I'll go through each of these. So the first piece is getting around, transportation. So while transportation in Canada may account for about 30% of our average household carbon emissions, Climate Action Waterloo Region estimates that in Waterloo Region, it accounts for 49% of all carbon emissions locally. And I should say, while significant, while promising, there are significant doubts due to other environmental limits like lithium supply that they can be taken to scale. So for example, if you look up car production per year, there are graphs on Google where you could see essentially the amount of personal cars being produced each year have been going up since, well, forever, but from the year 2000, it's pretty much doubled, and that's actually not an environmentally sustainable pace of vehicle production. And so for that reason, we will need to walk, bike, take public transportation, and carpool more. In fact, Transform WR, which is our city's climate strategy, talks about how one of their goals for our community by 2050 is that most trips will be done through active transportation. That is, we want to redesign our cities so we can bike and walk more and use our cars less. That's like official government strategy in our region. Home energy use is also really big. Another 30% of our overall emissions comes from home energy use, and in particular, how we heat and cool our homes in the winters and summers. Most winter heat still in Ontario comes from natural gas burning furnaces, and air conditioners in Ontario are electric, mostly coming from nuclear power. So what we need to do here for home energy use is twofold. Both electrify our sources of heat, for example, with heat pumps, but also retrofit our homes. Currently, in Canada, the pace of retrofits means that all homes will be retrofitted in Canada. Let me rephrase that question. How long do you think it will take to retrofit all homes in Canada? So better insulation, better windows, that kind of thing for home energy efficiency. We need to do it in the next 25 years. But as of this year, the current pace of retrofits, it would take 143 years. So again, this is not just, home energy use is not just about sources of energy, switching over to heat pumps, electrifying heat and cooling. but also about building efficiency, both retrofitting old buildings as well as when we build new buildings. And there are groups in our region like Green WR who are pushing for better green development standards. So that's key if we want people in 2050 to be warm in the winters. Our stuff, consumer goods, this is a tricky one because this is not counted in community or national level carbon accounting. So when the federal government or our municipal governments count our carbon emissions, they don't include consumer goods. And I'll get to the reason for that in a minute, but it's important. So everything we buy, ranging from like the clothes we're wearing to the pews to this microphone, everything comes at a carbon cost. There are embedded emissions in each stage of the life cycle of our stuff, from what it takes to mine the raw materials, to manufacturing, to transportation, to final waste disposal. Oh, I'm missing a slide here, that's okay. So if you imagine what it takes to produce this microphone, or what it would take to produce this cell phone, a lot of the early stages in production, including mining the materials, the manufacturing of the materials, often overseas, comes at a carbon cost because of electricity, burning coal to make these goods. So C40, which is a global consortium of cities trying to tackle the climate emergency, estimate if we included the carbon emissions from our stuff in citywide carbon accounting, our carbon emissions would be 60% higher. So I think it's really key. It's not just about transportation, not just about buildings, but dealing with excess consumerism. That's a key thing, and I say this 2 days after Black Friday. That's a key thing if we're going to tackle the climate emergency in the time we have to tackle it. And finally, our food. The final main source of carbon emissions, or I guess greenhouse gas emissions, globally comes from the food we eat, especially red meat. I apologize for that mistake. So beef, dairy, and cheese top the list of high emitters. And I think it's just important to recognize the ecological costs of our diet. So once again, thinking concretely, not about the abstract carbon dioxide molecule, but about our day-to-day lives, here are the 4 sources of our carbon emissions. How we get around, our cars, transportation, our homes, the stuff that we buy, and the food that we eat. This is a key concept, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, the difference between end use and embodied emissions. This is sort of, it feels technical, but it's not. It's highly relevant for all of our lives. So when we talk about carbon accounting and where our emissions come from, this is a key distinction. So end-use emissions are the emissions produced through the use of a product or an activity. So for example, the fumes that come out of your car when you're driving. Embodied emissions, on the other hand, are emissions emitted during the production of a product. For example, with the phone, if your phone was manufactured in China, a lot of electricity in China comes from coal generation, and so that means there's a carbon cost to your phone. As it happens, if you look at the entirety of global energy consumption, if you imagine in 1 year, global energy consumption as 1,000 units, 2 of those 1,000 units are the production of new cell phones. Of total global energy consumption, 2 of those 1,000 units are the production of new cell phones. This is a really useful graph. This is life cycle emissions of buildings. But I just want to point out like the different cycles, right? So there's extraction of raw materials, transportation to the factory, I can't point, manufacturing products, transportation, actual construction, and then waste disposal at the end of the life of the building. It's not just what a building uses, let's say in the winter to heat it, but it's everything that comes before and after in the life cycle of a building that produces carbon emissions. And I think this is really key as communities, as we try to tackle the climate crisis, to recognize embodied emissions. And since it's so important, I'm going to ask you to describe this in your own words. So just spend a minute and try to, in your own words, define what embodied emissions are. About 15 more seconds. All right. So just a bit of a perspective here on the relationship between production and consumption, the making of goods and the use of goods. When thinking about greenhouse gases, in terms of perspective, we can either think about it in terms of the production side, the site of production, where it's made, i.e. Fossil fuel production in the tar sands, or the site of consumption, where it's used. So we get our oil from Alberta, but then we use it, burn it in cars and planes. This is from 2017, the source of Canadian carbon emissions, like nationally. As you can see, 25% is transportation, industry is 10%, buildings are 12%, but 27% of Canada's national emissions comes from oil and gas. The blue is production-related emissions. Everything else is consumption-related emissions. And that leads to this question, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this is something you see a lot in the media, that 100 corporations cause 71% of emissions. And so what this means is essentially the 100 energy companies, the top 100 fossil fuel companies and things like that, cause 71% of emissions. And my question is, do you think this is honest, or do you think this is misleading? I don't have an answer to that question. That's just an open question. But I think this is a key question to ask.
So in those 100 corporations, you're talking about the oil producers and...
Yeah, the oil producers are near the top of that list. Yeah.
I think that's misleading.
So this is not a question we have to answer right now, but it's something I invite you to ponder as you go home. One thing to think about is if most of Canada's oil that we burn when we drive our cars and things like that comes from the oil sands in Alberta, it actually means that our personal carbon footprints actually might be a lot larger. So if you look at what's my carbon footprint if I drive to work each day, it might actually be quite larger because of the emissions in the oil sands. So in order to extract the oil, there's a lot of burning of oil that goes into that. Yeah, just something to consider. This isn't about guilt. This is about just awareness and literacy around embedded emissions and just the complexity of how this is all counted. Yep.
Are you going to come back to this question at some point?
Yeah, we can come back to it at the end. Yeah. I think one thing I will say is I think it's scientists at oil companies, especially ExxonMobil in the late 1970s, were aware of climate change. They had really good science to back up what was happening, and they hid it. They concealed it. They were essentially lied to the public. And I think in that way, some of the major fossil fuel companies bear a great deal of responsibility. But I don't think we can separate production and consumption in quite that neat of a way, as in they're fully responsible and we're not at all kind of thing. But now I want to talk about future impacts of climate change. And so, as a question, as global average temperatures rise, what are the predicted consequences? So don't go into detail, just list what you know. And again, I'll give you about a minute to reflect on this. As global average temperatures rise, as we near 1.5, maybe 1.7, 2 degrees of average warming, what are the predicted consequences? About 15 seconds. So as I go into this, I'm not actually going to go into a lot of details. I think if you want to go into details, you can do a Google search, go to your library, read about the predicted consequences. I'm just going to talk about representative consequences. Part of the reason is we know we have to act. We don't need to spend a lot of time on these, but I think it's good to consider a few different things. First of all is even in the best case scenario, it's going to get worse. We are already locked into about 1.2, 1.3 degrees of average warming. Scenes like this from Australia are going to be the new normal. I'm a bit younger than some people in this congregation. This is going to be my life, even in the best case scenario. Remember, even in the best case scenario, even if we are able to stay below 1.5 degrees, what average warming is now is going to go, average warming will increase beyond what it is now. And that's, we can still survive, we can still figure out ways to adapt to that, but that is the reality. But, key thought number 2, our collective choices matter. We still have a choice, collectively, of our temperature threshold. Do we want a 1.5 degrees Celsius world, or a 2 or 3 degree world? This personally really matters. It's a real choice, and it's one that's important. I think this does the best job that I can find of illustrating the differences between these possible futures. This is future droughts by average temperature threshold. On the top left corner is baseline, so that's essentially 1995, 2000. That was average droughts worldwide. To your right, the top right corner, is what a 1.5 degree world looks like. The red are serious risks of drought. So as you can see, even in a 1.5 degree world, there's going to be serious weather consequences. But then look at the bottom. At the bottom left, you have a world of 2 degrees. We're currently on the pathway towards that world. Or 3 degrees, which is still possible from where we are. If you just compare the red, the yellow, and the blue on these 4 maps, I think this really illustrates globally what our choices are. Again, we don't have to get to 3 degrees. That's our choice. We can still be at a 1.5 degree world, but right now we're on the pathway more towards the bottom futures. And relatedly, don't forget the scale. This represents, the blue dots represents cities that are threatened by sea level rise. So just a review of these 3 key facts. Climate change is already having consequences worldwide. It will continue having consequences, and these consequences will get worse, even in the best case scenario. But every degree, every increment of a degree of average warming still matters. If we could get to a 1.6 degree world rather than a 1.7 degree world, that means people will live. That means people will have food. That means Matthew 25 can be a real thing. There's a big difference. It's not just like 1.5 or 2 degrees that matters. It's all these differences. They matter. So we can't give up. So as a review, again, we talked about the 4 main sources of carbon emissions. Simply put, our homes, our cars, our food, our stuff. We talked about embodied emissions, naming the carbon cost of producing the things that we buy. And then the consequences of climate change is already happening and will get worse. So there's one last part of my presentation today, but again, that's a lot of information. So I want to give you 4 or 5 minutes again just to talk among yourselves about what you've been hearing. So go ahead. One and a half minutes left. 1.5 minutes. Thirty more seconds. Okay, I'll bring us back together again. Thankfully, I know your congregation is going to have many more conversations, both with me and with others. So this is just the beginning. I mean, maybe you've talked about it before, but this is not the end of the conversation. So we have one last section for us today, which is the title of our workshop, The Climate Emergency 101. What does it mean to act like it's an emergency? I don't know if people have seen this graphic. I think it's pretty funny. It's about 5 years ago. A lot of people were sharing it online. I think the idea of a dog being in a house that's on fire and saying this is fine is pretty ironic and a little bit close to home in terms of what is happening collectively with the climate emergency. Are we acting like it? So imagine you are in a crowded building. A school, a mall, maybe an office. The fire alarm starts to sound, but nobody does anything. They just do what they're doing before. Students sit studying, shoppers keep shopping, workers keep working. It's an emergency, but nobody is acting like it. Clearly, if you're in a building that's on fire, you know what it means for individuals to act like it's an emergency. They get out of the building. It's pretty obvious. But what about societally? When we're in a climate emergency, what are the indicators that we collectively are treating it like it's the emergency it is? Which is the question. What are indicators that governments are acting like it's an emergency they say it is? This is the second last question, and I'll give you this time a minute and a half to reflect on this question. So if you're asking governments, by the way, both our federal government and our regional municipality have declared climate emergencies, as well as about 30 other national governments and 2,000 local governments worldwide. So what are indicators that either local or federal governments are acting like it's an emergency they say it is? Just individual reflection at this point. About 20 more seconds. Okay, I do promise this is the last individual level question for today. Oh. So I really appreciate this list. This coming list is from the Canadian activist Seth Klein. In his book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, he compares our current situation to the situation we were collectively in during the Second World War, and he lists 5 indicators that our governments are actually acting like it's an emergency they declared it to be, whether with war, with COVID, or with the climate emergency. So here is Seth's list. And you can read more about this online as well. The first indicator is that the government spends what it takes to win. If you paid attention to how much the government was spending during COVID, the government is not nearly spending the same amount with the climate emergency. So that's the first indicator. It spends what it takes to win. And the same case was with both the Great Depression and the Second World War. Secondly, it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. We had CERB during COVID. During World War II, the Canadian government created 30 crown corporations. Third, there's a shift from voluntary and incentive-based programs to mandatory measures. We don't just bribe people to do what needs to be done, we demand it. And this is important. We tell the truth. Governments, our leaders, not just governments, but societal leaders, tell the truth about the severity of our situation and what we need to do to rise to the occasion. So if you remember in COVID, how often did the Prime Minister or our Premier go on the news and give updates? At one point, I think it was daily. We need exactly that level of regular updates, regular truth-telling from our leaders if we imagine they're actually acting like it's an emergency. If that's not happening, if they're not telling the truth, if they're not regularly updating it, they're not taking the emergency seriously. And finally, they act in equitable ways. We don't leave people behind in acting like it's an emergency. And that's a real temptation. Nationally, governmentally, when we've done emergency level mobilization before, we've often done it in inequitable and just ways. And we need to make sure that not only we act like it's an emergency, but we do so mindful of both democracy and fairness. So I'm going to get to Q&A in a second, but I want to have an invitation to you. I was thinking about this week, about acting like it's an emergency. And I was imagining myself in high school and imagining what would happen if my high school was on fire and the teachers weren't doing anything. And I was imagining the students, right? Because at first the students would be like, oh, they would look at the teachers, wondering if the teachers are going to do anything. But if they weren't, would the students stay there? No. At a certain point, the students themselves will act like it's an emergency. But they've done studies where they show if people are in a room and smoke starts coming in through the doorway, and I notice the smoke, I won't immediately think it's an emergency. I'll look at the people around me to see if they're thinking it's an emergency as well. So all that to say, it might be the case that our government is not acting like it's an emergency, but we might still have the power, individually and collectively, to indicate to each other that our house is on fire. And so my invitation to you, and this will be different, like every congregation, every community is different, but what would it look like for your church to act like it's a climate emergency? Not individually, but collectively, as a way to indicate to others that it's a climate emergency. What would that look like for you? What would be the indicators? I don't have the answers for you. That's not something I can decide, but collectively, in your discernment, what would that look like? And with that, I think I'm under time. I have 5 minutes till 1 o'clock, but I would welcome Q&A. I don't know if there's a possibility for the online Q&A, but at least in this room, I have a microphone here, so.
There's only 2 people online.
Oh, okay.
You could ask them if they wanted to send any questions to the chat.
No, we'll follow up.
All right.
One of them's probably.
Okay.
They'll follow up later. Don't worry about the small numbers.
Okay, yeah.
So could you go back? I'm looking back in my notes to see the slide where you asked us the question, is this a fair portrayal?
Okay. Yeah, I think I can go back there. Lots of clicking.
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah.
So Patrick said he thought that it was misleading. I wonder if you could just speak more to that slide, because I'm struggling to understand the message of it.
Right. So simply put, in the production of fossil fuels, like in Alberta, they come at a carbon cost. There's carbon emissions that come from just getting the oil out of the ground. And so the question is, once the oil is out of the ground, once we refine it, and once it gets to the gas pump and we put it in our cars, what part of that is our responsibility?
And so what is that slide saying? Is it saying that corporations are responsible and minimizing our role?
Yeah, so by saying 100 corporations cause 71% of emissions, they're focusing on production-based emissions, like in the tar sands, for example, but also with companies that produce consumer goods. And the question I have here is, if companies are producing things that we buy, is it 100% their responsibility, or do we share in that responsibility? Yeah. Yeah.
Another slide, a circle graph, showed that energy production is 27% of the carbon dioxide
In Canada.
emissions.
In Canada, yeah.
Okay, and then you're saying this is 71, so obviously you're saying that the 43% is us, or the user.
Here in this slide, sorry.
There's oil and gas right there.
Yeah.
You're saying 71% is from the 100 companies.
That's globally.
Okay, but
Yeah.
still,
Yeah.
I'm assuming we're going to be a representative of the world in many ways.
Okay.
Okay, that if Russia or Saudi Arabia or wherever, same numbers. Okay, so your slide there says it all. 71%. Who is it? It's the user. Part of it, at least.
Part of it. I would, because this is just the first workshop, I can't get into all the complexity of it. But I think there are different levels of responsibility. But I think it's my point in talking about this was simply for us to imagine what embodied emissions are and to see that connection in our daily lives. But I think, Wendell Berry, an environmental author that has really influenced me, has sometimes talked about just because taking care of our kids won't save the world doesn't mean we don't take care of our kids. So in the same way, I think it's important in the climate emergency not to imagine our own individual level actions or community level actions themselves are going to save the world, but it's still important to do those actions. Yeah. Yeah.
So, at 27% of the oil and gas, it doesn't happen unless they sell it.
Yep.
All right? We're selling it to somebody who's going to use it to make it or whatever. Okay, so the other side of that is 71% is all us. All of it is eventually the person that's using it.
Yep.
Whether it's the food or the plastic foam or whatever.
One of the there's a concept that sometimes environmentalists use around consumption where they distinguish personal consumption from structural consumption. So personal consumption is when we consume something, whether it's natural gas or that extra cell phone or whatever, and it's completely our choice. Structural consumption is when I can't feed my family unless I can drive to work. And the structure of our society doesn't allow me to walk, right? I do think that's an important distinction to make as well.
And actually, you have another slide to juxtapose your point, and that is that some of these large oil companies, the scientists knew a long time ago
Yep.
what was going on. At that point, if they begun to start moving towards some kind of intervention, then it would play through the way you're talking about, and that is changing the structural aspect of it so
Yep.
that other alternatives would be available, but clearly that wasn't putting money in big companies.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's definitely important. I'm aware that with our time, there's much more to talk about than we have time for, and I do apologize, but there are at least 6 more workshops that I'm offering to give, including workshops on climate justice and around what to do if the odds are stacked against us, which I would be happy to share at some point. So.
Wrest the microphone from your hand, and you're much better at the microphone than I am. But Isaiah, I want to thank you sincerely on behalf of the Justice Through Service Committee of Mount Zion and our whole congregation and community, including our online viewers, because I think the fact that we have more potential questions than time means we've got some real momentum and engagement going here. And this is going to be the start of a really, really fascinating and active journey. And that's exactly, I think, what we all were hoping for. I'll just make a brief observation. On the way in here, somebody asked me, are we going to learn anything new? And I said to the person, I know who they are, so I'm going to try and keep my eyes off the audience. I said, I thought that we would learn new things about what we already knew or felt. And I think that for once, I was kind of right. And Isaiah totally fulfilled that expectation that, yes, I've seen a lot of these numbers before, so have you. And we're trying to own them and embrace them and build them into our lives. And we're trying really, really hard. And Isaiah has given us some very, very cogent and powerful context in which to do that. So we've got a few weeks, couple of months maybe, to think about that, and we're definitely going to schedule the remaining 6 workshops in the series, and I'm looking forward to having Isaiah back here again. So keep the questions, keep journaling down. You wake up in the middle of the night with a question, write it down. I've got to ask Isaiah this next time. So again, Isaiah, thank you very, very much. I'm totally aware of how much preparation and research these workshops take and how much it takes to keep them up to date and to keep up to date with all the material that's coming through us through the media. Thank you very, very much.